Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a crime storytelling series for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we focus on a longer historical crime story. Let's go. The Resurrection Men, the Burke and Hair murders. In the shadowy closes and wines of Edinburgh's Old Town, where the stench of poverty mingled with the antiseptic smell of medical progress, a partnership was forged in 1827 that would forever change the relationship between science and crime. What began as a simple business arrangement between two Irish immigrants would evolve into a systematic campaign of murder that claimed at least 16 lives and shocked Georgian society to its core. The Edinburgh of the 1820s was a city of profound contradictions. Known as the Athens of the North for its intellectual achievements, it was simultaneously home to some of the worst urban squalor in Europe. The city's reputation as a center of medical learning drew students from across the globe, but the legal supply of cadavers for anatomical study was woefully inadequate for the demands of modern medical education. This shortage created a lucrative black market in human bodies that attracted a class of criminals known as resurrection men, grave robbers who supplied fresh corpses to anatomical schools for dissection. The trade was dangerous, distasteful, and highly profitable, requiring men who could overcome both legal obstacles and natural revulsion to profit from death. Into this world stepped William Burke and William Hare, two men whose names would become synonymous with murder for profit. They discovered that the ancient art of grave robbing could be made far more efficient through a simple innovation. Rather than digging up the recently dead, they would create their own supply of fresh corpses through systematic murder. Their method was deceptively simple and horrifyingly effective. They would identify vulnerable victims, the elderly, the sick, the friendless, and lure them to lodgings where they would be suffocated in a manner that left no obvious signs of violence. The bodies would then be sold to Dr. Robert Knox, one of Edinburgh's most prominent anatomists, who asked no questions about the source of his remarkably fresh specimens. This is the story of how two unremarkable men transformed themselves into history's most notorious body snatchers, creating a murder enterprise that would claim at least 16 lives before their inevitable exposure and downfall. It is a tale of medical ambition corrupted by greed, of scientific progress stained with innocent blood, and of the thin line that separates civilization from barbarism when human life becomes nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The partnership between Burke and Hare would demonstrate how quickly ordinary men could become monsters when presented with the right combination of opportunity, desperation, and moral blindness. Their crimes would shake Edinburgh society and force a reckoning with the ethical foundations of medical education, while their methods would influence criminal practices for generations to come. William Burke arrived in Edinburgh in 1818 as one of thousands of Irish immigrants seeking better prospects in Scotland's rapidly industrializing economy. Born around 1792 in County Tyrone, he had worked as a laborer, baker, and small-time entrepreneur before circumstances drove him to seek opportunities across the Irish Sea. His background was unremarkable. He was neither particularly intelligent nor notably ambitious, just another working-class Irishman trying to survive in an era of profound economic change. Burke's personal life was complicated by his relationship with Helen MacDougall, a woman who was legally married to another man, but who had become his common-law wife after fleeing domestic violence. This irregular arrangement forced them to live on the margins of respectable society, making lodgings in Edinburgh's overcrowded tenements where questions about one's past were rarely asked. The Edinburgh that Burke encountered was a city of stark contrasts and hidden opportunities. The elegant Georgian New Town, with its broad streets and neoclassical architecture, stood in sharp contrast to the medieval Old Town, where narrow closes and towering tenements housed thousands of poor immigrants, casual laborers, and social outcasts. It was in this underworld that Burke would find both his partner and his calling. William Hare, Burke's future accomplice, had arrived in Edinburgh several years earlier and had already established himself as a small-scale entrepreneur in marginal activities. Born in Ireland around 1792 or 1793, Hare possessed a cunning intelligence and flexible morality that had served him well in various dubious enterprises. By the time he met Burke, he was operating a lodging house in Tanner's Close, catering to the city's most desperate residents. Hare's lodging house was typical of Edinburgh's lowest-class accommodations, a cramped, filthy warren of rooms where beds were rented by the night to anyone who could afford the modest fee. The clientele included Irish laborers, Highland refugees, prostitutes, beggars, and various social outcasts who had nowhere else to turn. These people lived day to day with few possessions and fewer prospects, making them ideal victims for what would become a systematic murder enterprise. The partnership between Burke and Hair began with a chance encounter that would prove fatal for dozens of innocent people. In late 1827, Burke was seeking lodging after a dispute with his previous landlord, and he was directed to Hare's establishment by mutual acquaintances in Edinburgh's Irish community. The two men quickly discovered a shared willingness to engage in illegal activities for profit, though neither initially contemplated murder. Their first criminal collaboration involved the sale of a corpse that had died naturally in Hare's lodging house. An elderly pensioner named Donald, who owed Hare money for rent, died of natural causes in December 1827. Rather than reporting the death to authorities and losing the debt, Hare convinced Burke to help him sell the body to medical students who were always seeking fresh specimens for anatomical study. The decision to sell Donald's corpse was motivated by practical considerations rather than criminal ambition. Hare needed to recover the money owed to him, while Burke saw an opportunity to earn quick cash through minimal effort. Neither man had any experience with the body trade, but they had heard that Edinburgh's medical schools paid good money for fresh cadavers, no questions asked. Their inexperience nearly led to disaster when they first attempted to contact potential buyers. Not knowing the proper procedures for selling bodies, they made clumsy approaches to medical students who might have reported them to authorities. However, they were eventually directed to Dr. Robert Knox, one of Edinburgh's most prominent anatomists and a man known for his willingness to purchase specimens without inquiring too closely about their origins. Dr. Knox operated one of the most successful private anatomy schools in Edinburgh, competing with the university's medical faculty for students and reputation. His flamboyant teaching style and impressive collection of anatomical specimens made his lectures popular among medical students. But maintaining this reputation required a constant supply of fresh cadavers that the legal system could not provide. The legal supply of bodies for anatomical dissection was severely restricted by both law and custom in early 19th century Scotland. Only the corpses of executed criminals could be legally dissected, and these numbered only a few dozen per year throughout all of Scotland. Meanwhile, Edinburgh's medical schools required hundreds of bodies annually to meet the demands of their growing student populations. This shortage had created a thriving black market in human corpses, supplied primarily by grave robbers known as resurrection men. These criminals would dig up recently buried bodies and sell them to anatomists for substantial sums, usually between £8 and £14 per corpse. More than most working men earned in a month, the trade required specialized knowledge, considerable physical effort, and significant risk of prosecution if caught. Burke and Hare's sale of Donald's corpse to Dr. Knox netted them £7 10s, a substantial sum that opened their eyes to the profits available in the body trade. The transaction was conducted with businesslike efficiency. Knox's assistants examined the corpse, pronounced it suitable for dissection, and paid in cash without asking uncomfortable questions about how two Irish laborers had come to possess such a fresh specimen. The ease of this first transaction convinced Burke and Hair that they had discovered a reliable source of income that could supplement their legitimate earnings. However, they also recognized that opportunities to sell naturally deceased bodies would be limited and unpredictable. The logical next step was to explore more systematic approaches to body procurement. Their initial plan involved traditional grave robbing, and they spent several weeks learning the techniques employed by established resurrection men. This included identifying recently buried corpses, planning nighttime expeditions to local cemeteries, and developing methods for transporting stolen bodies without detection. However, they quickly discovered that grave robbing was both physically demanding and highly risky. The breakthrough that would transform Burke and Hair from petty criminals into systematic murderers came when they realized that creating fresh corpses was far more efficient than stealing old ones. The idea may have occurred to them independently, or they may have been inspired by conversations with other criminals. But by early 1828, they had decided to begin killing people for profit. Their first murder victim was another lodger at Hare's establishment, a miller named Joseph who had fallen ill and was unlikely to recover. Rather than waiting for him to die naturally, Burke and Hare decided to accelerate the process by suffocating him with a pillow while he was weakened by fever. The method left no obvious signs of violence, making the death appear natural to casual observers. The sale of Joseph's corpse to Dr. Knox netted another substantial payment, confirming Burke and Hare's belief that systematic murder could provide them with a reliable and lucrative source of income. The ease with which they had killed Joseph and disposed of his body convinced them that they had discovered the perfect crime, one that was virtually undetectable and highly profitable. The psychological transformation that allowed Burke and Hare to become murderers was facilitated by their victim selection strategy. They targeted people who were already marginalized by society: the sick, the elderly, the friendless, and the poor. These individuals were unlikely to be missed by anyone important, and their deaths could easily be attributed to natural causes given their vulnerable circumstances. The development of their murder method was guided by practical considerations rather than sadistic impulses. Burke and Hare were not interested in inflicting suffering for its own sake. They simply wanted to kill people efficiently and profitably while minimizing the risk of detection. Their suffocation technique was chosen because it left no obvious wounds and could be performed by two men working together. The partnership dynamics between Burke and Hare were complex and would prove crucial to both their success and their eventual downfall. Burke was generally considered the more personable of the two, better able to gain victims' trust and lure them to their deaths. Hare was more calculating and business-minded, managing the financial aspects of their enterprise and maintaining contact with Dr. Knox. The establishment of their murder enterprise required careful attention to operational security and victim selection. Burke and Hare developed systematic approaches to identifying potential targets, creating opportunities for murder, and disposing of evidence. Their success would depend on their ability to kill regularly while maintaining the appearance of respectability in Edinburgh's criminal underworld. By the spring of 1828, Burke and Hare had committed themselves to careers as professional murderers, though they would continue to think of themselves as businessmen providing a valuable service to the medical community. Their transformation from petty criminals to systematic killers was complete, and they were ready to begin the campaign of murder that would terrorize Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents. The killing technique perfected by Burke and Hare was both ingeniously simple and horrifyingly effective, combining elements of stealth, efficiency, and deniability that made their murders nearly undetectable to contemporary forensic methods. Their method, which would later be known as Burking, represented a significant innovation in criminal methodology that maximized profit while minimizing risk of discovery. The development of their suffocation technique was driven by practical considerations rather than psychological sadism. Burke and Hare were not interested in torture or prolonged suffering. They simply wanted to kill people quickly and cleanly while leaving no obvious signs of violence that might arouse suspicion when the bodies were sold to anatomists. The method typically began with the identification and isolation of a suitable victim. Burke and Hare preferred targets who were already weakened by illness, intoxication, or age, making them easier to overpower and less likely to put up effective resistance. The ideal victim was someone who was alone, friendless, and unlikely to be missed by anyone who might investigate their disappearance. The actual killing process required careful coordination between the two men and was usually performed in a private room at Hare's lodging house, where screams would not be heard by neighbors or other lodgers. The victim would be lured to the room under some pretext, offered shelter, food, or companionship, and then suddenly attacked when they were relaxed and unsuspecting. Burke typically served as the primary killer, using his superior size and strength to restrain the victim, while Hare assisted by blocking escape routes and preventing calls for help. The actual suffocation was accomplished by pressing a pillow or similar object over the victim's face, while simultaneously compressing their chest to prevent breathing. This method was physically demanding, but could be completed within a few minutes. The psychological aspects of their killing method reveal important insights into the mindset that enabled Burke and Hare to commit multiple murders without apparent remorse. By using suffocation rather than more violent methods like stabbing or beating, they could maintain some psychological distance from their crimes and convince themselves that they were simply accelerating natural deaths rather than committing deliberate murder. The choice of victims was crucial to the success of their method, as Burke and Hare needed people who could be killed without arousing suspicion from authorities or the community. They developed sophisticated criteria for target selection that took into account factors such as the victim's health, social connections, financial resources, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. Elderly pensioners were particularly attractive targets because their deaths could easily be attributed to natural causes, and because they often carried small amounts of money that provided additional profit beyond the sale of their corpses. Burke and Hare also targeted sick individuals whose deaths would seem inevitable, allowing them to claim they were simply putting suffering people out of their misery. The timing of their murders was carefully planned to coincide with optimal market conditions for body sales. Burke and Hare learned that Dr. Knox paid higher prices for fresh corpses, and that demand was highest during the winter months when medical school classes were in session. They adjusted their killing schedule accordingly, murdering more people during peak demand periods. The preservation and transportation of bodies after murder required considerable logistical planning and specialized knowledge. Burke and Hare had to ensure that corpses remained fresh enough to command top prices while avoiding detection during transport to Dr. Knox Anatomy School. They developed techniques for cooling bodies and concealing them during delivery. The physical evidence left by their suffocation method was minimal, which contributed significantly to their ability to avoid detection for so long. Unlike stabbing or beating, suffocation left no obvious wounds or bloodstains that might arouse suspicion. Victims appeared to have died peacefully in their sleep, and contemporary medical knowledge was insufficient to detect signs of deliberate suffocation. The partnership dynamics during murders revealed the different roles that Burke and Hare played in their criminal enterprise. Burke was generally the more physical participant, doing most of the actual killing, while Hare provided support and managed logistics. This division of labor reflected their different personalities and capabilities, while ensuring that both men were equally implicated in their crimes. The psychological conditioning required to commit multiple murders was facilitated by their gradual escalation from single opportunistic killings to systematic murder campaigns. Each successful murder made the next one easier to contemplate and execute, as Burke and Hare became desensitized to violence and focused increasingly on the financial benefits of their activities. The development of their murder method was influenced by their observations of other criminals and their analysis of successful techniques used in similar crimes. Edinburgh's criminal underworld provided them with models and inspiration, while their own experience taught them how to refine and improve their methods to maximize effectiveness and minimize risk. The seasonal variations in their murder rate reflected both market conditions and practical considerations related to body preservation and transportation. Winter murders were easier to conceal because cold weather helped preserve corpses, while summer killings required more careful timing to ensure that bodies remained fresh enough to command good prices from anatomists. The selection of murder locations was guided by practical considerations, including privacy, accessibility, and the ability to dispose of evidence. Hare's lodging house provided an ideal base of operations because it offered privacy, attracted vulnerable potential victims, and provided cover for unusual activities that might otherwise arouse suspicion from neighbors. The weapons and tools used in their murders were deliberately chosen to be common household items that would not arouse suspicion if discovered by authorities. Pillows, blankets, and similar objects were used for suffocation, while rope might be employed for restraint if necessary. The absence of specialized murder weapons helped maintain their cover as legitimate businessmen. The disposal of evidence beyond the corpses themselves required careful attention to detail and systematic destruction of anything that might link them to their victims. Personal belongings were typically destroyed or disposed of in ways that prevented identification, while witnesses were intimidated or eliminated if they posed threats to operational security. The refinement of their technique over time reflected both their growing experience and their analysis of near misses or detection risks. Burke and Hare constantly adjusted their methods based on feedback from Dr. Knox about body quality and their own observations about what worked best in different circumstances. The psychological impact of their murder method on the victims themselves was deliberately minimized to reduce the risk of struggles or calls for help that might attract attention. Quick, efficient killing was preferred over prolonged suffering, not from humanitarian considerations, but from practical concerns about operational security and evidence destruction. The training and practice required to perfect their suffocation technique involved experimentation with different approaches and careful observation of results. Burke and Hair learned through trial and error how to kill people most efficiently while leaving the least evidence, treating murder as a technical skill to be mastered rather than a moral issue to be contemplated. The scalability of their murder method was limited by the physical demands of suffocation and the need to maintain operational security. While they could theoretically kill more people by recruiting additional accomplices, Burke and Hare recognized that expanding their operation would increase the risk of exposure and detection by authorities. The ultimate effectiveness of their suffocation method was demonstrated by their ability to commit at least 16 murders over nearly 2 years without detection. Their technique was so successful that they might have continued indefinitely, if not for a combination of greed, carelessness, and changing circumstances that eventually led to their exposure and downfall. Dr. Robert Knox occupied a unique position in Edinburgh's medical establishment as both a respected anatomist and a willing participant in the city's thriving black market for human corpses. His role in the Burke and Hare murders was not that of a passive buyer, but an active enabler who created the demand that drove their killing spree and who deliberately ignored obvious signs that his suppliers were committing murder to obtain fresh specimens. Knox had established himself as one of Edinburgh's most popular anatomy teachers through a combination of showmanship, genuine expertise, and a willingness to acquire teaching materials through questionable means. His private anatomy school competed directly with the University of Edinburgh's medical faculty, and his success depended on maintaining a constant supply of fresh cadavers that could not be obtained through legal channels. The legal restrictions on anatomical dissection in early 19th century Scotland created an impossible situation for medical educators who needed hundreds of bodies annually but could legally obtain only a handful of executed criminals. The Murder Act of 1752 had designated dissection as an additional punishment for murder, making it deeply associated with crime and social disgrace in the public mind. This association made it politically impossible to expand legal access to bodies for medical education. Knox's solution to this dilemma was to cultivate relationships with body snatchers and resurrection men who could provide him with specimens obtained through illegal means. He paid premium prices for fresh corpses and asked no questions about their origins, creating a market incentive for increasingly sophisticated criminal operations like the Burke and Hare partnership. The anatomy school operated by Knox was located at 10 Surgeon Square in Edinburgh's Old Town, a few hundred yards from the High Court, where Burke would eventually be tried for murder. The building housed lecture theaters, dissection rooms, and storage areas where bodies could be kept until needed for educational purposes. The proximity to Edinburgh's legal district would prove grimly ironic, given Knox's role in facilitating systematic murder. Knox's teaching methods were revolutionary for their time, emphasizing hands-on dissection and practical anatomical knowledge rather than the theoretical approaches favored by university professors. His lectures were theatrical performances that combined scientific instruction with entertainment, drawing large audiences of medical students who paid substantial fees for the privilege of attending. The financial incentives that drove Knox's involvement in the body trade were considerable. Each student paid significant sums for access to anatomical instruction, while the constant need for fresh specimens created ongoing demand that could support criminal enterprises like Burke and Hare's murder operation. Knox's school generated substantial profits that depended entirely on his ability to obtain bodies through illegal means. The relationship between Knox and his body suppliers was characterized by deliberate ignorance and willful blindness to obvious criminal activity. Knox established procedures that allowed him to purchase bodies without learning details about their origins, while suppliers understood that asking prices would be paid promptly for fresh specimens, regardless of how they were obtained. Burke and Hare's first contact with Knox was facilitated by his reputation as a reliable buyer who paid top prices and asked no uncomfortable questions. The ease of their initial transaction encouraged them to view Knox as a business partner rather than a customer, leading to a regular supply relationship that would enable their systematic murder campaign. The quality standards demanded by Knox for anatomical specimens inadvertently encouraged murder over grave robbing as a source of fresh bodies. Recently buried corpses were often in poor condition due to decomposition or embalming, while murdered victims could be delivered within hours of death in perfect condition for dissection. Knox's preference for high-quality specimens created market incentives that favored killing over traditional body snatching. The payment system used by Knox for body purchases was designed to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring reliable supply. He paid in cash immediately upon delivery, with prices varying based on the condition and freshness of specimens. This system encouraged suppliers to kill people rather than waiting for natural deaths or digging up deteriorated corpses. Knox's interactions with Burke and Hair reveal his awareness that their supply methods were unusual and probably criminal. The remarkable freshness of their specimens, their regular delivery schedule, and their lack of experience with traditional grave robbing should have aroused suspicion in any reasonably observant buyer. Knox's failure to investigate these warning signs suggests deliberate complicity in their crimes. The anatomical knowledge possessed by Knox should have made him aware that many of the bodies supplied by Burke and Hair showed signs of violence or unusual circumstances surrounding death. His training as a physician would have enabled him to recognize evidence of suffocation or other forms of deliberate killing. Yet he continued to purchase specimens without asking questions about their origins. The social status enjoyed by Knox as a prominent member of Edinburgh's medical community provided him with protection from scrutiny that enabled his participation in criminal activities. His reputation as a respected scientist made it difficult for authorities to believe that he might be involved in systematic murder, while his influential connections helped shield him from investigation. The educational justifications offered by Knox for his involvement in the body trade reflected broader tensions between scientific progress and moral constraints in early 19th century medicine. He argued that anatomical knowledge was essential for training competent physicians, and that legal restrictions on body procurement were obstacles to medical advancement that had to be overcome through any means necessary. The student body at Knox's anatomy school was largely unaware of the criminal origins of their teaching materials, though some may have suspected that their specimens were obtained through illegal means. The culture of medical education encouraged students to focus on scientific learning rather than ethical considerations, making it easier for Knox to maintain his supply relationships without criticism from clients. The competition between Knox and other anatomy teachers created pressure to maintain reliable supplies of high-quality specimens regardless of their origins. Knox's success depended on his ability to offer superior teaching materials, making him willing to pay premium prices for fresh bodies and to overlook obvious signs of criminal activity among his suppliers. The documentation of Knox's transactions with Burke and Hair was deliberately minimal to maintain plausible deniability and avoid creating evidence that might be used against him if authorities investigated his activities. This record-keeping strategy protected Knox, but also made it difficult to determine the full extent of his complicity in their murder campaign. The preservation and storage of bodies at Knox's anatomy school required sophisticated facilities and procedures that enabled him to maintain inventory of specimens obtained from various sources. His ability to handle large numbers of bodies without attracting attention from authorities demonstrates the extent to which the medical establishment had accommodated itself to illegal body procurement. The international reputation of Edinburgh's medical schools depended partly on the quality of anatomical instruction offered by teachers like Knox, creating institutional pressure to maintain supply relationships with body snatchers regardless of the moral implications. The city's status as a center of medical learning required a continuous flow of fresh specimens that could only be obtained through criminal means. The eventual exposure of Burke and Hare's murder campaign would force Knox to confront the moral implications of his business relationships, though he would continue to deny knowledge of their criminal activities. His role in enabling systematic murder through his willingness to purchase bodies without asking questions would become a central issue in debates about medical ethics and the regulation of anatomical education. The legacy of Knox's involvement in the Burke and Hair murders would influence the development of medical education and the regulation of anatomical dissection throughout the British Empire. His case demonstrated the need for legal reform that would provide adequate supplies of bodies for medical education while preventing the creation of market incentives for murder. The 16 known victims of Burke and Hair represented a cross-section of Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents, people whose marginal social status made them easy targets for murder and whose disappearances were unlikely to prompt serious investigation by authorities. The systematic selection of these victims reveals both the calculating nature of the killers and the harsh realities of life for society's outcasts in early 19th century Scotland. The victim selection criteria employed by Burke and Hare were developed through careful observation of Edinburgh's underclass and analysis of which people could be killed without arousing suspicion. They preferred targets who were isolated, sick, elderly, or otherwise vulnerable, reasoning that such individuals were likely to die soon anyway and would not be missed by anyone who might demand justice for their deaths. Mary Patterson, one of their most tragic victims, was an 18-year-old prostitute who represented the type of person that Burke and Hare could kill with virtual impunity. Her profession made her socially marginalized, while her youth and beauty made her corpse particularly valuable to anatomists who preferred attractive specimens for teaching purposes. Her murder demonstrated the killer's willingness to target anyone whose death could be profitable. The circumstances of Mary Patterson's death reveal the calculated nature of Burke and Hare's victim selection and murder methods. She was lured to their lodgings with promises of shelter and companionship, then murdered when she was too intoxicated to resist effectively. Her body was sold to Dr. Knox within hours of her death, while her personal belongings were destroyed to prevent identification. James Wilson, known as Daft Jamie, was a mentally disabled teenager whose murder shocked even Edinburgh's criminal underclass when the details eventually became known. His intellectual disabilities made him an easy target for Burke and Hare, who exploited his trusting nature to lure him to his death. The killing of someone so obviously innocent and vulnerable revealed the complete absence of moral restraint among the murderers. The targeting of disabled individuals like Daft Jamie reflected Burke and Hare's understanding that such people were considered expendable by Georgian society and that their deaths would generate little public sympathy or official investigation. The systematic victimization of the mentally ill demonstrates how social prejudices of the era facilitated criminal exploitation of vulnerable populations. Elderly pensioners formed another preferred category of victims for Burke and Hare, who recognized that their deaths could easily be attributed to natural causes given their advanced age and typically poor health. These individuals often lived alone and had few social connections, making them ideal targets for murder that would not be detected or investigated by authorities. The murder of Margaret Haldane, an elderly woman who had sought shelter at Hare's lodging house, exemplified the killer's systematic approach to targeting the aged and infirm. Her death was accomplished through their standard suffocation method, and her body was sold to Dr. Knox as a routine business transaction. The ease with which they killed and disposed of elderly victims encouraged them to continue targeting this vulnerable population. Irish immigrants formed a disproportionate number of Burke and Hare's victims, reflecting both the killer's connections to Edinburgh's Irish community and their understanding that such people were unlikely to be missed by authorities who viewed them as undesirable foreigners. The targeting of fellow immigrants reveals the predatory nature of their relationship with their own ethnic community. The selection of Irish victims also provided Burke and Hare with operational advantages, as they could more easily gain the trust of people who shared their national background and cultural experiences. Their ability to speak with authentic Irish accents and reference familiar places and customs made it easier to lure victims to their deaths while avoiding suspicion from potential witnesses. Women comprised a significant proportion of Burke and Hare's victims, reflecting both their vulnerability in Georgian society and their value as anatomical specimens. Female corpses were particularly prized by medical schools for teaching purposes, creating market incentives that encouraged the targeting of women regardless of their individual circumstances or behavior. The systematic victimization of women by Burke and Hare reveals important aspects of gender relations and social protection in early 19th century Edinburgh. Women who lived alone or engaged in socially disapproved activities like prostitution were essentially defenseless against predators who understood that their deaths would generate little public concern or official investigation. Children and teenagers were also targeted by Burke and Hare when circumstances permitted, though the murder of young people carried higher risks due to greater public sympathy and more intensive investigation of their disappearances. The killing of victims like Daft Jamie demonstrates their willingness to murder anyone whose death could be profitable, regardless of age or innocence. The geographic distribution of victims reflects Burke and Hare's systematic approach to target selection and their understanding of which areas of Edinburgh contain the most vulnerable potential victims. They focused primarily on the Old Town's overcrowded tenements and closes, where poverty and social disorganization made people easy targets for predation. The seasonal patterns in victim selection may have been influenced by both market demand for anatomical specimens and the availability of vulnerable targets during different times of year. Winter months provided more opportunities to kill elderly or sick individuals whose deaths could be attributed to harsh weather conditions, while summer periods required more careful selection to avoid detection. The documentation of victim identities and circumstances provides historians with unusual insight into the lives of Edinburgh's underclass during the Georgian period. The detailed records of Burke and Hare's crimes preserve information about people who would otherwise have been forgotten by history, revealing the harsh realities faced by society's most vulnerable members. The investigation of victim backgrounds during Burke's trial revealed the complex social networks that connected Edinburgh's marginal populations and the ways in which predators could exploit these relationships for criminal purposes. The testimonies of witnesses who had known the victims provide rare glimpses into the daily lives and struggles of people living on society's margins. The psychological impact of the murders on Edinburgh's vulnerable populations was severe and lasting, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that affected relationships within the city's underclass. People who had previously sought shelter and companionship from strangers became wary of trusting anyone, while the knowledge that murder for profit was possible changed fundamental assumptions about personal safety. The failure of authorities to investigate the disappearances of Burke and Hare's victims until their crimes were exposed demonstrates the extent to which certain populations were considered expendable in Georgian society. The systematic murder of 16 people over nearly 2 years without official investigation reveals troubling attitudes about whose lives were worth protecting and whose deaths deserve justice. The ultimate tragedy of Burke and Hare's victims lies not only in their individual deaths, but in what their murders reveal about social attitudes and institutional failures that made such crimes possible. Their stories serve as a reminder of the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the importance of social systems that protect society's most defenseless members from exploitation and violence. By the summer of 1828, Burke and Hare had transformed Hare's lodging house in Tanner's Close into what amounted to a systematic murder operation, with standardized procedures for identifying victims, carrying out killings, and disposing of bodies. The efficiency of their operation rivaled legitimate businesses in its organization and profitability, generating substantial income through the systematic elimination of Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents. The physical layout of Hare's lodging house was ideally suited for their criminal enterprise, providing both access to potential victims and privacy for carrying out murders. The building's maze of cramped rooms and narrow corridors allowed the killers to isolate victims from other lodgers, while the transient nature of the clientele meant that disappearances were unlikely to be noticed or investigated by authorities. The operational procedures developed by Burke and Hare were refined through experience and designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk of detection. They established routines for victim selection, murder execution, body preparation, and disposal that could be repeated with assembly line precision. This systematization allowed them to kill regularly while maintaining the appearance of legitimate lodging house operators. The victim identification process began with careful observation of potential targets who sought accommodation at Hare's establishment or who were encountered in Edinburgh's streets and taverns. Burke and Hare developed criteria for assessing the suitability of potential victims based on factors such as health, social connections, financial resources, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. The recruitment of victims typically involved offers of shelter, food, or companionship that appealed to people's basic needs and vulnerabilities. Burke's personable manner and apparent sympathy for the struggles of fellow Irish immigrants made him particularly effective at gaining victims' trust and persuading them to accompany him to Hare's lodging house where they would be murdered. The timing of murders was carefully planned to coincide with optimal conditions for body disposal and sale. Burke and Hare preferred to kill people during periods when Dr. Knox was actively seeking fresh specimens, and when the lodging house had few other occupants who might witness suspicious activities. Weekend evenings were particularly favored because they provided cover for unusual sounds or activities. The murder process itself had been refined through practice into a systematic procedure that could be completed quickly and efficiently. The killers would wait until victims were relaxed or intoxicated before launching their attack, using their suffocation method to kill people without creating obvious signs of violence that might arouse suspicion when bodies were examined by anatomists. The preparation of bodies for sale required specialized knowledge and equipment that Burke and Hair had acquired through experience and observation. They learned how to position corpses to conceal signs of violence, how to preserve freshness during transport, and how to package bodies for discreet delivery to Dr. Knox's anatomy school. The transportation of corpses from the murder site to Knox's establishment was accomplished through carefully planned routes and timing that minimized the risk of detection by authorities or curious observers. Burke and Hair used tea chests, sacks, and other containers to conceal bodies during transport, while their familiarity with Edinburgh's streets allowed them to avoid heavily traveled areas. The financial management of their murder enterprise was handled with business-like efficiency, with careful tracking of expenses and revenues that allowed them to maximize profitability. They maintained records of payments received from Dr. Knox, costs associated with victim acquisition and body preparation, and profits generated by their systematic killing operation. The division of labor between Burke and Hair was based on their individual strengths and preferences, with Burke typically serving as the primary recruiter and killer, while Hair managed logistics and maintained contact with Dr. Knox. This specialization allowed them to operate more efficiently while ensuring that both partners remained equally committed to their criminal enterprise. The security measures implemented to protect their operation included procedures for maintaining secrecy, disposing of evidence, and dealing with potential witnesses who might threaten their activities. Burke and Hair developed methods for intimidating suspicious neighbors, eliminating compromising evidence, and maintaining cover stories that explained unusual activities at the lodging house. The psychological conditioning required to commit multiple murders was facilitated by their gradual escalation from opportunistic killings to systematic murder campaigns. Each successful murder made subsequent killings easier to contemplate and execute, as Burke and Hair became increasingly desensitized to violence and focused on the financial benefits of their activities. The quality control measures applied to their murder operation were designed to ensure that bodies met Dr. Knox's standards for anatomical specimens while minimizing evidence that might lead to detection. Burke and Hair learned to kill people in ways that preserve the integrity of organs and tissues valued by anatomists, while avoiding damage that might reduce the commercial value of their products. The inventory management system developed by the killers allowed them to coordinate murder timing with market demand, ensuring that fresh bodies were available when Dr. Knox needed specimens for his lectures and demonstrations. They learned to anticipate seasonal variations in demand and adjust their killing schedule accordingly to maximize profits. The customer service approach employed by Burke and Hair in their dealings with Dr. Knox was designed to maintain a reliable business relationship that would ensure continued demand for their products. They provided prompt delivery, consistent quality, and flexible scheduling that made them preferred suppliers compared to traditional grave robbers who offered less reliable service. The expansion possibilities for their murder operation were limited by both practical constraints and security considerations. While Burke and Hair occasionally considered recruiting additional accomplices to increase their killing capacity, they ultimately decided that operational security required keeping their partnership small and secretive. The competitive advantages enjoyed by Burke and Hair over traditional body snatchers included their ability to provide fresher specimens, more reliable delivery schedules, and consistent quality that met anatomist requirements. Their innovation of creating fresh corpses through murder rather than digging up deteriorated remains gave them significant market advantages. The risk management strategies employed by the killers were designed to minimize the probability of detection while maintaining profitable operations. They avoided killing people who were likely to be missed, disposed of evidence systematically, and maintained cover stories that explain their activities to curious neighbors or authorities. The technological innovations developed by Burke and Hair for their murder enterprise included specialized techniques for suffocation, body preservation, transportation, and disposal that were adapted to their specific operational requirements. Their methods represented significant advances over traditional approaches used by other criminals in similar activities. The marketing approach used to promote their services to Dr. Knox emphasized the superior quality and reliability of their specimens compared to those available from other suppliers. Burke and Hair positioned themselves as premium providers who could deliver fresh, undamaged bodies on predictable schedules that met the needs of busy anatomists. The organizational culture within their murder operation was characterized by shared commitment to profitability, systematic approach to victim selection and killing, and mutual dependency that bound the partners together despite occasional tensions. Their partnership succeeded because both men recognized that their individual survival depended on maintaining operational security and continued cooperation. The performance metrics used to evaluate their murder enterprise included factors such as killing frequency, body quality, payment amounts, and operational security. Burke and Hair tracked these measures to identify opportunities for improvement and to ensure that their activities remained profitable and sustainable. The succession planning for their murder operation was complicated by the highly personal nature of their partnership and the specialized skills required for successful body snatching. Neither Burke nor Hair made serious efforts to train replacement personnel or develop institutional knowledge that could survive their individual involvement. The quality assurance procedures implemented by Burke and Hair were designed to ensure that their murder methods produced specimens that met Dr. Knox's requirements while avoiding evidence that might lead to detection. They developed standardized approaches to killing, body preparation, and delivery that maintained consistent quality across multiple transactions. The customer relationship management strategies employed by the killers were focused on maintaining Dr. Knox's satisfaction and loyalty while avoiding questions about their supply methods. They provided reliable service, competitive pricing, and flexible terms that made them valuable business partners, despite the obviously criminal nature of their activities. The operational efficiency achieved by Burke and Hair was remarkable considering their lack of formal business training or experience in systematic murder. Their ability to kill regularly while maintaining cover as legitimate lodging house operators demonstrates sophisticated understanding of operational security and process management. The scalability limitations of their murder operation became apparent as they contemplated expansion to meet growing demand from Edinburgh's anatomy schools. The personal nature of their killing method and the security requirements of their operation made it difficult to increase production without compromising operational security. The competitive intelligence gathered by Burke and Hair about other body suppliers allowed them to position their services advantageously while avoiding conflicts with established resurrection men who might threaten their operations. They learned to operate in market segments that were underserved by traditional grave robbers. The supply chain management challenges faced by Burke and Hair included coordinating victim acquisition with demand from Dr. Knox, managing body preservation during storage and transport, and disposing of evidence without attracting attention from authorities or suspicious neighbors. The performance optimization efforts undertaken by the killers involved continuous refinement of their murder methods, victim selection criteria, and delivery procedures to maximize profitability while minimizing risk. Their systematic approach to improvement demonstrates remarkable dedication to operational excellence in criminal activities. The business model developed by Burke and Hair was fundamentally different from traditional body snatching in its emphasis on creating fresh inventory through murder rather than recovering existing corpses through grave robbing. This innovation provided them with significant competitive advantages, but also created unique operational challenges and moral hazards. The partnership dynamics between Burke and Hair were crucial to their operational success, as their complementary skills and shared commitment to profitability allowed them to overcome individual limitations while maintaining the trust and cooperation necessary for systematic murder. Their relationship would ultimately prove to be both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness. The Burke and Hair murder operation could not have sustained itself for nearly 2 years without the knowing or unknowing assistance of numerous individuals who formed a network of complicity that extended throughout Edinburgh's medical and criminal communities. The systematic nature of their crimes required the cooperation, ignorance, or silence of dozens of people who either participated directly in their activities or chose to overlook obvious signs of criminal behavior. Helen McDougall, Burke's common-law wife, occupied a central position in this web of complicity as both witness to the murders and active participant in concealing evidence. Her presence during several killings made her an accessory to murder, while her assistance in disposing of victims' belongings and maintaining cover stories made her essential to the operation's success. McDougall's role in the murders was complex and evolved over time, from reluctant witness to willing accomplice. Initially horrified by Burke's criminal activities, she gradually became desensitized to violence and began actively participating in victim recruitment and evidence disposal. Her transformation from innocent bystander to criminal accomplice illustrates how proximity to systematic violence can corrupt even initially moral individuals. Margaret Hare, William Hare's wife, played a similar role in facilitating the murder operation through her management of the lodging house and her interactions with potential victims. Her position as the establishment's hostess allowed her to identify vulnerable individuals who might be suitable targets while providing cover for unusual activities that might otherwise arouse suspicion. The relationship between the two women was characterized by mutual dependency and shared complicity that bound them together despite occasional tensions and disagreements. Both understood that their survival depended on maintaining operational security and supporting their partner's criminal activities, creating a conspiracy of silence that protected the murder operation from exposure. Dr. Knox's assistants and students at his anatomy school formed another layer of complicity through their willingness to accept Burke and Hare's specimens without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. These individuals possess the medical knowledge necessary to recognize signs of recent violence or unusual circumstances surrounding death, yet they chose to ignore obvious evidence of criminal activity. The culture of deliberate ignorance that characterized Knox's anatomy school was essential to the murder operation's success, as it provided a reliable market for fresh corpses without the inconvenience of moral scrutiny or legal investigation. Students and faculty members understood that their educational opportunities depended on maintaining this conspiracy of silence. David Patterson, one of Knox's preparators, played a particularly important role in facilitating the body trade through his direct involvement in purchasing and processing specimens. His professional expertise made him aware that many of Burke and Hare's corpses showed signs of recent violence, yet he continued to accept deliveries without reporting his suspicions to authorities. The porter and other staff members at Knox's anatomy school were complicit through their assistance in receiving and processing illegally obtained bodies. These individuals helped unload corpses, transport them to dissection rooms, and dispose of remains after educational use, making them active participants in a criminal enterprise that depended on systematic murder. Neighbors and fellow lodgers at Hare's establishment formed another category of complicit individuals who chose to ignore suspicious activities rather than risk confrontation with dangerous criminals. Their silence was purchased through a combination of fear, indifference, and small bribes that ensured they would not report unusual sounds or activities to authorities. The transient nature of the lodging house's clientele facilitated this conspiracy of silence, as temporary residents had little incentive to investigate suspicious activities or report concerns to authorities. People who were themselves living on society's margins were unlikely to cooperate with law enforcement officials who viewed them as inherently untrustworthy. Local merchants and service providers who sold supplies to Burke and Hare became unwitting accomplices through their provision of materials used in the murder operation. Tea chests used for transporting bodies, rope and cloth used for restraining victims, and preservatives used for maintaining corpse quality were all obtained through legitimate commercial channels. The whiskey sellers and tavern keepers who served Burke and Hare alcohol that was used to intoxicate victims were also complicit in their crimes, though most were probably unaware of how their products were being used. The systematic use of alcohol to make victims more vulnerable demonstrates the killer's understanding of how legitimate businesses could be exploited for criminal purposes. Hackney cab drivers and porters who assisted in transporting bodies became accessories to murder through their willingness to accept payment for services without asking questions about suspicious cargo. The culture of urban anonymity that characterized Edinburgh's transportation services made it possible to move corpses without arousing official attention. Members of Edinburgh's Irish immigrant community were complicit through their failure to investigate the disappearances of fellow immigrants who had been murdered by Burke and Hair. The social isolation and mutual suspicion that characterized immigrant communities made it easier for predators to operate without detection or interference from potential protectors. Law enforcement officials demonstrated their complicity through their failure to investigate obvious signs of criminal activity or to respond appropriately to reports of suspicious behavior. The systematic disappearance of vulnerable individuals should have triggered official investigation, yet authorities chose to ignore evidence that might have exposed the murder operation. Medical professionals beyond Knox's immediate circle were complicit through their acceptance of the body trade as a necessary evil, and their failure to demand reform of laws that created market incentives for murder. The broader medical community's willingness to benefit from criminal activities while maintaining plausible deniability enabled systematic killing for profit. Court officials and legal professionals were complicit through their failure to prosecute body-snatching cases vigorously or to investigate connections between anatomy schools and criminal suppliers. The legal system's tolerance for the illegal body trade created an environment where murder for profit could flourish without serious risk of punishment. Religious leaders demonstrated complicity through their failure to condemn the body trade or to demand protection for vulnerable members of their congregations. The church's emphasis on spiritual rather than temporal concerns allowed systematic predation to continue without moral leadership that might have prevented or exposed criminal activities. Social reformers and charity workers were complicit through their failure to investigate the systematic disappearance of people they claimed to serve. Organizations dedicated to helping the poor and vulnerable should have noticed patterns of disappearance that might have led to earlier detection of the murder operation. Government officials at local and national levels demonstrated complicity through their failure to reform laws that created market incentives for murder or to provide adequate funding for law enforcement activities that might have detected criminal operations. Political indifference to the welfare of society's most vulnerable members enabled systematic predation. The press and intellectual community were complicit through their failure to investigate or publicize the systematic disappearance of vulnerable individuals until after the murder operation had been exposed through other means. Journalists and writers who claimed to speak for social justice ignored obvious evidence of systematic criminal activity. The ultimate exposure of Burke and Hare's crimes would reveal the extent of this web of complicity and force a reckoning with the moral compromises that had enabled systematic murder to continue for nearly 2 years. The knowledge that so many people had either participated in or ignored obvious criminal activity would shock Edinburgh society and contribute to broader reforms in medical education and law enforcement. The legacy of this complicity would influence Scottish attitudes toward institutional responsibility and moral accountability for generations, demonstrating how individual moral failures could combine to enable systematic evil when people chose personal convenience over ethical obligation to protect society's most vulnerable members. The beginning of the end for Burke and Hair came on October 31st, 1828, when their systematic murder operation finally encountered a victim whose death could not be concealed or explained away as natural. The killing of Margaret Docherty, an elderly Irish woman who had sought shelter at Hare's lodging house, would expose the entire criminal enterprise and bring justice for at least 16 innocent victims. The circumstances surrounding Margaret Docherty's murder were typical of Burke and Hare's previous crimes, but the aftermath would prove dramatically different due to a combination of changed circumstances and investigative pressure that had been building throughout their criminal career. Their growing confidence and carelessness would prove to be fatal flaws that enabled authorities to finally detect and prosecute their systematic murder operation. Margaret Docherty arrived at Hare's lodging house on October 30th, 1828, seeking accommodation during her visit to Edinburgh. She was exactly the type of victim that Burke and Hare preferred: elderly, Irish, friendless, and unlikely to be missed if she disappeared. However, her murder would occur under circumstances that made concealment impossible and detection inevitable. The presence of other lodgers at Hare's establishment during Docherty's stay created complications that Burke and Hare had not adequately anticipated or planned for. James and Anne Gray, a couple who were renting a room at the lodging house, became suspicious when they noticed that the elderly woman who had been staying in their room had suddenly disappeared without explanation. The Greys' suspicions were aroused by several factors that revealed the inadequate planning and execution that characterized this particular murder. They had spoken with Margaret Docherty on the evening before her death and were surprised to find her gone the next morning without having collected her belongings or paid her bill. Their attempts to inquire about her whereabouts were met with evasive and contradictory explanations from Burke and Hair. The discovery of Margaret Docherty's body by the Grey couple was the result of their persistent curiosity and Burke and Hare's failure to properly secure the crime scene. The corpse had been hidden under a bed in the lodging house, poorly concealed and easily discovered by anyone who conducted even a cursory search of the premises. James Gray's decision to report his discovery to the police marked the beginning of serious official investigation into Burke and Hare's activities for the first time since their murder operation had begun. Previous disappearances had been ignored or inadequately investigated by authorities. But the discovery of a fresh corpse under suspicious circumstances could not be dismissed or explained away. The initial police investigation revealed numerous pieces of evidence that connected Burke and Hare to Margaret Docherty's death and suggested that her murder was not an isolated incident. The condition of the body, the circumstances of its concealment, and the behavior of the suspects all pointed to deliberate murder rather than natural death. The interrogation of Burke, Hare, and their wives revealed inconsistencies and contradictions in their accounts of recent events that strengthened investigators' suspicions about their involvement in systematic criminal activity. Each suspect told different versions of what had happened to Margaret Docherty, and none could provide convincing explanations for the presence of her body in their lodging house. The decision by William Hare to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution proved to be the crucial breakthrough that enabled investigators to understand the full scope of the murder operation. Hare's detailed confession provided evidence of at least 16 murders and revealed the systematic nature of their criminal enterprise. Hare's testimony described the evolution of their partnership from opportunistic body snatching to systematic murder, providing investigators with insights into their methods, motivations, and victim selection criteria. His account revealed the business-like nature of their operation and the careful planning that had enabled them to kill regularly without detection for nearly 2 years. The investigation of Dr. Knox's anatomy school revealed the extent to which the medical establishment had facilitated Burke and Hare's murder operation through willful ignorance and deliberate blindness to obvious criminal activity. Knox's failure to question the source of unusually fresh specimens made him complicit in systematic murder, though he would never be prosecuted for his role. The examination of Burke and Hare's financial records and personal possessions provided additional evidence of their involvement in criminal activities and helped investigators understand the economic motivations that had driven their murder campaign. The substantial sums they had received for selling bodies could not be explained through legitimate activities. The search of Hare's lodging house and other locations associated with the suspects revealed physical evidence that corroborated Hare's confession and provided independent verification of details about their murder methods and victim disposal techniques. This evidence was crucial for building a prosecution case that could secure conviction despite the difficulties of proving crimes that had been carefully concealed. The identification of previous victims through witness testimony and missing person reports revealed the systematic nature of Burke and Hare's crimes and the extent to which they had preyed upon Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents. The pattern of disappearances that had been ignored by authorities was finally recognized as evidence of systematic murder. The public reaction to news of the Burke and Hare murders was one of horror and outrage, as Edinburgh citizens realized that systematic killers had been operating in their midst for nearly 2 years. The knowledge that 16 people had been murdered for profit shocked even a society accustomed to urban violence and criminal activity. The media coverage of the investigation and subsequent trial created a sensation that extended far beyond Edinburgh to encompass national and international attention. The systematic nature of the crimes and their connection to medical education made the case particularly fascinating to contemporary observers who struggled to understand how such activities could have continued undetected. The arrest and detention of Burke, Hare, and their wives marked the end of their murder operation and the beginning of legal proceedings that would determine their fate. The strength of the evidence against them made conviction likely, though the legal strategies employed by defense attorneys would influence the specific charges and sentences imposed. The cooperation agreement that protected Hare from prosecution in exchange for his testimony against Burke was controversial but necessary to secure conviction of at least one of the murderers. The decision reflected prosecutors' recognition that proving the crimes would be difficult without insider testimony from someone who had participated directly in the killings. The preparation for trial required extensive investigation to corroborate Hare's testimony and build a case that could convince a jury of Burke's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution faced the challenge of proving crimes that had been carefully concealed and of establishing the credibility of a confessed murderer whose testimony was essential to securing conviction. The anticipation surrounding Burke's trial reflected public fascination with the case and demand for justice for the 16 known victims of their murder operation. The proceedings would provide the first public accounting of systematic killing for profit and would influence public attitudes toward medical education and body snatching for generations to come. The unraveling of Burke and Hare's murder operation demonstrated both the power of persistent investigation and the importance of witness cooperation in exposing systematic criminal activity. Their detection and prosecution would serve as a warning to other potential criminals while providing some measure of justice for their innocent victims. The trial of William Burke began on December 24, 1828, in Edinburgh's High Court of Justiciary, drawing massive crowds and international attention to what would become one of the most notorious criminal proceedings in Scottish legal history. The case represented not only the prosecution of a systematic murderer, but also a broader reckoning with the moral compromises that had enabled the illegal body trade to flourish in Edinburgh's medical community. The prosecution case was built around William Hare's detailed confession and testimony, which provided insider knowledge of the murder operation that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional investigation. Hare's decision to cooperate with authorities in exchange for immunity had made him the Crown's star witness, though his credibility as a confessed murderer would be vigorously challenged by Burke's defense team. Lord Justice Clerk David Boyle presided over the trial with the assistance of Lords Pitmilly, Mackenzie, Meadowbank, and Gillies, creating a judicial panel that reflected the seriousness with which Scottish legal authorities viewed the case. The court's composition demonstrated official recognition that the Burke and Hare murders had implications that extended far beyond ordinary criminal proceedings. The indictment against Burke charged him with 3 specific murders, those of Mary Patterson, James Wilson, Daft Jamie, and Margaret Docherty, though prosecutors acknowledged that evidence suggested he had participated in at least 16 killings over nearly 2 years. The limitation to 3 charges reflected the practical difficulties of proving crimes that had been systematically concealed and the legal requirement for corroborating evidence. Sir William Ray, the Lord Advocate, led the prosecution with a team of experienced criminal lawyers who understood the challenges of securing conviction based primarily on the testimony of an accomplice who had received immunity in exchange for cooperation. The prosecution strategy focused on corroborating Hare's account through physical evidence and witness testimony that supported key details of his confession. Burke's defense was conducted by a team of prominent advocates led by Henry Cockburn and George Patton, who faced the difficult task of discrediting Hare's testimony while providing alternative explanations for the evidence that linked their client to the murders. The defense strategy emphasized the unreliability of accomplice testimony and the prosecution's failure to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The testimony of William Hare was the centerpiece of the prosecution case, providing detailed accounts of how he and Burke had systematically murdered at least 16 people over nearly 2 years. His confession described their victim selection methods, killing techniques, and business relationship with Dr. Robert Knox's anatomy school, painting a comprehensive picture of organized crime for profit. Hare's account of the murders was methodical and businesslike, describing the killings as commercial transactions rather than acts of violence. His testimony revealed the calculating nature of their partnership and the systematic approach they had developed for identifying victims, carrying out murders, and disposing of evidence while maintaining the appearance of legitimate lodging house operators. The cross-examination of Hare by Burke's defense attorneys was aggressive and prolonged, focusing on his credibility as a witness who had received immunity in exchange for testimony against his former partner. Defense lawyers highlighted inconsistencies in his account and questioned his motives for cooperating with prosecutors rather than maintaining loyalty to Burke. The testimony of Helen McDougall and Margaret Hare provided additional insights into the murder operation, while revealing the extent to which both women had been complicit in their partner's crimes. Their accounts corroborated key details of Hare's confession, while demonstrating how the systematic killings had corrupted everyone associated with the criminal enterprise. Physical evidence presented during the trial included items found at the crime scenes, materials used in the murders, and financial records that documented payments received from Dr. Knox for body sales. This evidence helped corroborate Hare's testimony and provided independent verification of details about the murder operation that might otherwise have been dismissed as fabrication. The testimony of James and Anne Gray, the lodgers who had discovered Margaret Doherty's body, provided crucial evidence about the circumstances surrounding the final murder that had led to the exposure of the entire criminal enterprise. Their account of discovering the corpse and reporting it to authorities demonstrated how the killer's growing carelessness had finally enabled detection. Medical testimony about the condition of the victims' bodies revealed evidence of violence that supported the prosecution's contention that the deaths had been caused by deliberate murder rather than natural causes. Expert witnesses described signs of suffocation and other trauma that contradicted defense claims that the victims had died naturally. Witness testimony from members of Edinburgh's medical community revealed the extent to which the illegal body trade had been tolerated and even encouraged by anatomy schools desperate for fresh specimens. These accounts provided context for understanding how Burke and Hare's murder operation had been able to operate with impunity for nearly 2 years. The defense case focused on challenging the credibility of Hare's testimony and questioning the sufficiency of evidence to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys argued that their client had been the victim of a conspiracy between Hare and prosecutors who had sacrificed Burke to protect more prominent figures involved in the illegal body trade. Character witnesses testified about Burke's previous good behavior and his reputation as a hard-working laborer who had no history of violence or criminal activity before his association with Hare. The defense strategy emphasized Burke's previously clean record and suggested that he had been led astray by his more experienced and calculating partner. The closing arguments presented by both sides reflected broader debates about medical education, legal reform, and social responsibility that had been sparked by the revelation of systematic murder for profit. Prosecutors argued that Burke's conviction was necessary to demonstrate that no one could profit from the systematic killing of innocent people, while defense attorneys maintained that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The jury deliberation lasted 50 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of murdering Margaret Doherty, while returning verdicts of not proven on the charges related to Mary Patterson and James Wilson. The mixed verdict reflected the jury's careful consideration of the evidence, while acknowledging the difficulties of proving crimes that had been systematically concealed. Lord Justice Clerk Boyle's sentencing remarks emphasized the heinous nature of Burke's crimes and their impact on public confidence in medical education and legal institutions. The death sentence imposed on Burke was accompanied by the additional punishment of public dissection, creating a form of poetic justice that would subject the murderer to the same fate as his victims. The public reaction to Burke's conviction was one of satisfaction that justice had been served, though many observers expressed frustration that Hare had escaped punishment through his cooperation agreement with prosecutors. The knowledge that at least one of the murderers would face execution provided some comfort to a community that had been shocked by the revelation of systematic killing. The international attention generated by Burke's trial influenced public debates about medical education and the regulation of anatomical dissection throughout the British Empire and beyond. The case demonstrated the need for legal reforms that would provide adequate supplies of bodies for medical education while preventing the creation of market incentives for murder. Burke's execution on January 28, 1829, drew enormous crowds and marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal cases in Scottish history. His death provided closure for the victims' families and served as a warning to others who might consider similar crimes, while his public dissection served as a final demonstration of the consequences of murder for profit. The legacy of Burke's trial would influence Scottish criminal law and medical education for generations, establishing precedents for dealing with systematic murder while contributing to reforms that would prevent similar crimes in the future. The case remains a landmark in the history of forensic investigation and criminal prosecution, demonstrating how persistent investigation and witness cooperation could expose even the most carefully concealed criminal enterprises. The execution of William Burke on January 28, 1829, before a crowd of 25,000 spectators, marked the end of one of Scotland's most notorious criminal enterprises. But the impact of the Burke and Hair murders would resonate through British society for generations. The systematic killing of at least 16 innocent people for profit had exposed fundamental flaws in medical education and legal institutions while demonstrating the terrifying efficiency with which ordinary men could become monsters when presented with the right combination of opportunity and moral corruption. The public dissection of Burke's corpse by Professor Alexander Munro at Edinburgh University provided a fitting conclusion to a case that had begun with the illegal sale of human bodies to anatomists. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that the man who had murdered people to supply anatomical specimens would himself become a teaching aid for medical students. His skeleton eventually displayed in the university's anatomy museum as a permanent reminder of his crimes. William Hare's fate was less dramatic, but equally significant for understanding the long-term consequences of their partnership. Released from custody after testifying against Burke, he faced a hostile public that viewed him as equally guilty, despite his legal immunity. Hare was forced to flee Edinburgh and eventually Scotland itself, living in exile and obscurity until his death decades later. His escape from legal punishment served as a permanent reminder of the compromises that had been necessary to secure Burke's conviction. Dr. Robert Knox faced professional destruction despite avoiding criminal prosecution for his role in facilitating the murders. His anatomy school lost students and credibility as the public recognized his complicity in creating the market demand that had driven Burke and Hare's killing spree. Knox was eventually forced to leave Edinburgh and spent his remaining years as a marginal figure in London's medical community, his reputation permanently tainted by association with systematic murder. The immediate legislative response to the Burke and Hair case was the Anatomy Act of 1832, which revolutionized the legal framework for obtaining bodies for medical dissection. The act expanded the legal supply of cadavers to include unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals, eliminating the market incentives that had made murder profitable while ensuring adequate specimens for medical education. The social impact of the murders extended far beyond legal reform to influence public attitudes toward medical education and the treatment of society's most vulnerable members. The systematic targeting of the poor, elderly, and disabled by Burke and Hair had revealed how social prejudices could facilitate criminal exploitation, leading to increased awareness of the need to protect marginalized populations from predators. The case also demonstrated the importance of forensic investigation and witness testimony in exposing systematic criminal activity. The techniques developed by Edinburgh police during their investigation of the murders influenced criminal investigation methods throughout the British Empire, while Hare's cooperation with prosecutors established precedents for plea bargaining that would become standard practice in complex criminal cases. The international attention generated by the Burke and Hair case influenced medical education and anatomical legislation in countries throughout Europe and North America. The Scottish experience served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate legal frameworks for body procurement, leading to reforms that prevented similar crimes in other jurisdictions. The cultural legacy of the murders was equally significant, inspiring countless works of literature, theater, and popular entertainment that explored themes of medical ethics, criminal psychology, and social responsibility. The Burke and Hair story became a permanent part of British folklore, serving as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of greed and the importance of moral constraint in scientific pursuits. The psychological insights provided by the case contributed to early understanding of criminal behavior and the social conditions that could transform ordinary individuals into systematic killers. The partnership between Burke and Hair demonstrated how mutual reinforcement and shared guilt could enable escalating criminal behavior, while their victim selection methods revealed sophisticated understanding of social vulnerabilities. The economic analysis of their murder operation provided important lessons about the relationship between market incentives and criminal behavior. The substantial profits available from body sales had created powerful motivations for murder, while the lack of legal alternatives had made criminal activity seem like a rational business decision to men with flexible moral constraints. The failure of Edinburgh's social institutions to protect vulnerable residents from systematic predation revealed important weaknesses in urban governance and law enforcement that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of the murders. The case demonstrated how institutional indifference to the welfare of marginalized populations could enable criminal exploitation on a massive scale. The medical ethics debates sparked by the case contributed to the development of modern bioethical frameworks that balance the needs of scientific research with respect for human dignity and individual rights. The Burke and Hair murders served as a foundational case study in discussions about consent, exploitation, and the moral limits of scientific inquiry. The long-term impact on Edinburgh itself was profound, as the city struggled to overcome its association with systematic murder and restore its reputation as a center of medical learning. The reforms implemented in response to the case eventually strengthened Edinburgh's medical institutions, but the memory of Burke and Hair remained a permanent part of the city's historical consciousness. The influence on criminal investigation techniques extended beyond the immediate case to encompass broader developments in forensic science and detective work. The systematic approach used to expose Burke and Hare's crimes became a model for investigating complex criminal enterprises, while the use of accomplice testimony established important precedents for prosecuting organized crime. The Burke and Hair case ultimately serves as a powerful reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within ordinary human beings when moral constraints are removed and criminal activity becomes profitable. Their transformation from unremarkable Irish immigrants into systematic murderers demonstrates how quickly civilized behavior can deteriorate when individuals choose personal gain over ethical obligation. The 16 known victims of their murder campaign remain the true focus of historical memory, representing not only individual tragedies, but also broader failures of social protection and institutional responsibility. Their deaths served a purpose their killers never intended: the exposure of systematic evil and the implementation of reforms that would prevent similar crimes in the future. The story of Burke and Hair continues to fascinate contemporary audiences because it illuminates timeless questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the relationship between scientific progress and moral constraint. Their crimes serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of treating human life as a commodity and the importance of institutional safeguards that protect society's most vulnerable members from exploitation. In the end, the Burke and Hair murders represent both the worst and best aspects of human nature: the capacity for ordinary people to become monsters when presented with the right incentives, and the ability of societies to recognize evil, demand justice, and implement reforms that prevent similar tragedies. Their legacy serves as both cautionary tale and inspiration, reminding us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against the forces that would reduce human beings to mere objects of profit and exploitation. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.